Hello, my name is Jonathan Brown. I'm here with Mitchell Johnson, and this is a meaningful discussion on the role of government. So, the first thing I want to ask you about, Mitchell, specifically, or I guess is let's lay some groundwork, is historically, you and I have always, I think, had a similar kind of approach towards a perspective on government of being participatory. That being said, I met you lobbying a state government.
hmm
Our friendship was really born out of going and interacting with people at a higher political power level than ourselves. So, just to start off, what got you into that and how is that translated into your current work?
Yeah, so I think my interest with politics can be traced back to high school, watching like The Daily Show with Jon Stewart and The Colbert Report, kind of these satirical parody news programs. Not really parody, there was actual substance to it, but watching these programs that kind of took a comedic edge to the coverage of politics, which can be very absurd at times. Things that happen on in our government can be extremely absurd. So applying that lens to it is, I think, very fun when done correctly. But I watched those in high school. Kind of had that kind of pop like kind of pop politics lens to everything I looked at. Very young, very I'd say radical, but very, very, very left wing. And then I got into college. I think politics kind of took a back seat. I was more interested in pursuing like a broadcast journalism major at the time. I think I was halfway through my sophomore year with a political science minor, and I like binge watched the first two seasons of The West Wing, and I said that's what I want to do. So, switched poli sci up from a minor to a second major and got involved a bit more in student government, not until the end of my time at our institution. But that's kind of the roadmap that took me there. I had the chance to, in student government, do some pretty cool public policy research stuff. That's what a lot of my coursework on that major kind of revolved around and specialized in. And then I just kind of took that and got a foot in the door basic job now or job before I worked with a different department with the state of Washington that didn't really tie it all into anything I'd learned in college. Just kind of got my foot in the door. And then now I'm working in a role in compliance where I'm actively needing to, primarily read like laws, like bills as they're written and understand what they're supposed to mean. I'm not so much dipping in anymore into my own interpretation or trying to like, I guess, lobbying or pushing for anything, but it's more just interpreting what's already there and occasionally trying to avoid something that would make people very upset or causing some kind of political incident. But
Yeah, that
that's
makes
kind of the
sense.
full diagram of where I started, where I'm at now in terms of political work.
I think that there's an important distinction that we should probably make so we can avoid clamoring too far into a political conversation and just like there's bureaucratic governance, which is a lot of
hmm
what you do,
Yep.
and like the political or the politicization, however you want to put it, of some concept doesn't always apply in bureaucratic implementation. Like
hmm
politicization again of, you know, how something is going to be collected as a tax or how something is going to be, it's very narrow, and that implementation conversation is generally already hashed out when it gets to your kind of hands.
hmm
I think to me there's three general like groups that governance can be structured into, and that's public servants, which is your police officers, your firefighters, people who work in institutionalized healthcare. Regardless of the scope of it, there's a wide array of more like hourly based like jobs where it's you're collecting a wage and you work either part-time or work your way into full-time employment with some county or district or whatever as a small employee. Then there's the scope that you're at where you're affecting against the state level, but you're
hmm
still a full-time employee of the government that went through a hiring process and was you know you had your own employment hurdles to get into that position and processes and whatnot. And then you have people who are elected and appointed officials where it's at the state and federal level. And those three groups have kind of different purposes. And that's kind of what I want to kind of delve into with you here, because I think
Mm-hmm.
it's very easy to abstract everything against elected officials or everything against the police or everything against the lady that worked at the registrar's office in like Kentucky and create a monolith out of instances and then make assessments against the efficacy of the entire system using that monolith. And I want to move away from that and push towards assessing in a more generalized view the value purposes and the things that aren't, implicitly valuable to us, but are implicitly valuable towards the system at large. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I get you.
So I'd say my first question for you is, with your time at the state level, what do you think, what's your interpretation of the purpose of state level employees at and around in the scope of your kind of the stuff that you do, the stuff that you're talking about, like managing roadways, things like that, right? Those kind of like big state level scale organizations. How do you think that your purpose identifies in just the general populace's view?
Yeah, I guess it feels like mostly as actors for the laws that already exist and then future laws that may get passed with the state. It does kind of flow down from elected officials, I feel. We, again, have a participatory government. The base level of that participation is voting. So people vote in their elected officials, and those elected officials then have a lot of fun conversations, both behind closed doors and in their greater elected chambers over and in committees over what the needs of the people are, what policies do we have now that are working well, what policies do we have now that maybe need some improvement, what are policies that we need that we don't currently have. So based on what their mandates are when they're elected, they're kind of handed that, they work together, maybe stuff gets passed, maybe stuff doesn't. We're more or less just trying to figure out, I guess, at a base level, like maintaining whatever the current status quo has been, on whatever policies there are, enacting those. And then when new policies do get introduced, we do have a duty to interpret those. There's recently was a program passed in Washington State, like enacted last year, that basically is a tax credit that is given to lower income families and working individuals in the state. That is something that I don't believe the actual implementation for was all that hashed out when the bill was passed. So they had to figure out, okay, how many employees is this going to take? Like, what's the cost of this program going to be? What's it going to look like? How are we going to determine who's eligible for this? So I guess when we work with anyone from the public, what their perception of us probably is I don't know. I guess like I'm tracing back to my head when I go to the like Department of Licensing. I'm getting my driver's license renewed. It feels almost kind of clinical.
I think that to get onto that point of it feels clinical,
Mm-hmm.
I think that is a big core aspect of governmental purpose that is a shared aspect, is that there is not a lot of emotional investment any one individual should have at any level of the processing. It should feel
Mm-hmm.
disconnected and sanitary, and it should feel consistent across the board. Like, and that's a big part of discrimination policy, is that there are people who don't have that experience, and so there's a representation of, you can say this feels clinical and it can present as a positive thing, but at the same time someone can say that and it's a very problematic damnation of that system, like excluding people, right? The clinical nature looks and says you're outside of the bounds of the normal, labor producing citizen of the country. And so because of that, the amount of effort that goes into facilitating you is clinically diminished.
Yeah, and I don't know how well I can speak for the experience that most people have dealing with most state employees or employees of the government. I know sometimes someone will send me an email, and I will email them back the same day, or I'll call them back the same day after they call me and leave a voicemail, and they'll be surprised, like, you got back to me same day. Kind of maybe gets into some different territory, but Yeah, I think that's part of also why it's important, kind of touching back to the how it might feel clinical. Yeah, it's why it's important to have also a workforce that I think represents the people they're serving, because if you have people who aren't used to dealing with, people who look a certain way or talk a certain way or act a certain way, then those people could potentially not get the level of service that they deserve.
Yeah, and that they're paying for. I think that
Yeah.
fundamentally that like the cultural competency aspect of like actively representing the constituents that you're serving is one of those things that it's taken as a like an obvious for granted thing for a lot of American culture because it's set up that way. Honestly, it feels like problematically, right? So there's
Hmm.
instances where it's not like that, but like the historical representation of segregation and redlining and gerrymandering districts and all of those effects, I think they play a role in the like is your governmental experience supposed to be good, right? Do you live in an area where like your government it feels like it represents you and it's people that you can go and see, yes, these people see eye to eye with me. And the more it's shifting and power is shifting out, the easier it is to scatter that and to
Hmm.
the poorer communities in the countries and states will get more affected by it not representing them because they get shoehorned through redistricting into some other location.
Yeah, I guess more's coming to mind now that I'm thinking more time about it. I feel usually also when people are going to do some kind of work with the government, it's like either they did something wrong, so they're gonna have like to pay a penalty for something, or they're like trying to stay in compliance with something. They're trying to make sure their driver's license is renewed on time. They're trying to make sure their car tabs are, renewed on time. Are like the most common things I can think of. They're paying property tax, they're paying use tax on a vehicle, so that can already maybe feel like it can put things that I don't want to say tense, but it might feel like punishment to some people. Like if I'm going to Walmart and I'm going to go buy a TV, like yeah, I'm going to get dinged $1,000, but I'm getting a TV out of it. But if I'm putting new tabs on my car, it's like this thing I already bought. I'm basically buying, paying for the right to continue using it in this state and not getting hassled for it.
Yeah,
Um,
not getting shaken
so
down by
yeah, not
people
getting
who
stopped by it. Yeah.
I like this. This comes to a bigger point is that getting stopped by police for registration is a byproduct of like, this gets to the what is their purpose, and I think public servants like police and firefighters and healthcare workers that are in those public sectors are specifically lightning rods for criticisms of bad policy, right? Because
Hmm.
like I can sit here and say stop and frisk is a bad policy and that the police shouldn't do that, but that's not a criticism of the police doing stop and frisk. It's a criticism of the person who implemented the policy and then mandated that police go do that, right? And go disrupt people's existence. And so it gives an abstraction layer for the people who are in the position of political power and are in the position of not just creating legislation, but also popularizing legislation and normalizing the concepts in that legislation, even if they don't get passed, so they stay in the public discourse, and then all of the grief that's coming towards it gets put against what is essentially working class people who are taking what is essentially one of the safest routes to participating in the market economy, which is public sector work, right? It's not
Hmm.
like police officers, firefighters, you have to do training, but it's the same with the military of it's guaranteed as long as you kind of do what they tell you to and don't mess up that you'll keep getting paid, right? Like it's not for the most part cognitively complex work. It doesn't
Hmm.
require you to constantly be able to show that not only you understand the interaction levels, like because what you're doing has a lot to do with, I'd say, financial math, and I think that applying against financial math with constructive, understood legislation requirements that moves it up a tier, right, in terms of cognitive complexity, in the same way that being an elected official, the cognitive complexity of that isn't just creating policy, but it's making sure that that policy fits in line with the constituents that elected you, the people that financed you, the different companies and corporations that supported you, all of that, making sure that there's congruency there, right? And that's where the cognitive complexity comes in, is can you maintain dissonance while doing something that and keep working, right? Can you hold that dissonance in your mind and keep working towards a better system?
Yeah, and maybe to delve a little bit on that top level, the elected official too, is, I mean, another thing that can come into play there would be, because sometimes you're going to vote on things, this maybe is more a federal level, or I guess state level it applies too. There might be times where you need to vote on something that really isn't going to have a large effect to you, apart from siphoning out additional tax funds out of a budget, or collecting another tax, or doing anything like that you might vote on because it's you're part of a voting block. That you need to vote yes on this thing or no on this thing in order to potentially get a yes or no vote on something that's important to you. Which can almost kind of add another abstraction layer. There is just, what's a good example? I know that I think for how much she's hated by some people online, Nancy Pelosi, as a specific politician, is extremely effective at whipping votes.
Yeah.
That's what made her such a good majority leader or Speaker of the House, is that she just knew how to draw these dots between people of, okay, maybe it's going to be a little electorally painful for you to scratch this person's back on this thing, but if you do that, we'll make sure we scratch your back on this thing. And it's connecting those dots of making sure everyone's incentives are aligned within your, I guess, voting block or political party is definitely something at play there. Another thought I had from what you were saying is when it comes to state employees, and this maybe applies to public servants on a case-by-case basis, but they can be very difficult to fire. It isn't just police officers. Like, I know they have like police unions and firefighters have firefighter unions. I'm pretty sure firefighters probably aren't coming under the lens of public scrutiny as much as police officers do, because
just
usually
letting buildings burn down.
yeah. I mean, I imagine that was probably been a thing in the history of the United States. But yeah, I mean, police officers often are making choices of life and death for either what they perceive to be their own lives or the lives of people around them. But even though I know police unions are a hot button issue in wake of a lot of the BLM stuff in the last few years and some of the high profile cases that have come up with deaths of minorities at police hands. Yeah, I mean, there are, at least in Washington, full-time government employees are also represented by a union that is pretty powerful. I'm a member of it, so I'm not speaking against it. But it can definitely be difficult to fire employees once they become permanent with the state. I'm trying to figure out where that factors into the conversation as we were having it before.
Well, I think this kind of gets on an interesting point, though, is the volume of employees in governance is something that I think, it's something that I didn't consider until I had gotten out of the military. Because they constantly push. There's over 1 million active duty military members in the United States. It's something like 1.6 million. And that's a microcosm in comparison to how many employees you have in states like California, how many employees you have in the federal government in general, and then how many elected officials each state has, and how many appointed officials each state's elected officials' cabinets include, right? And it starts sprawling. And when you start actually nailing down the numbers of how many people are under employment, it's in like the 20 millions, right? And I think that that's one of those things that most people fail to grasp the full scope of. The value of governance work is that it's facilitating the employment of what's essentially like an eighth of the working class. That's a big deal.
Yeah, roughly.
And like that's it's emergency services, it's bureaucracy, it's licensing, it's inspections, it's all sorts of different, like, who knows how banks would work if the FEIC didn't exist, right? Like, there's these layers and layers and layers of implementation that are meant, I think, explicitly to operate as a barrier towards the systematic advantage, like disproportionization of power through capital systems. And that's just a byproduct of transactions, right? As you do
Hmm.
transactions and someone accumulates more money, they have more power in a system, and it functions as a like a funnel for that to operate through, where it limits the amount of power aggregation an individual can have. And I think roughly in the recent years that's kind of diminished in its broader sense of the federal side of a lot of individual actors and companies have gotten kind of free reign on acceleration in power aggregation. And this is, it's not just marketplace domination, it's also like drawing in things that weren't seen as competitors in the market and then accumulating them in kind of underhanded ways. Like a good example of this is Microsoft pulled in a bunch of different companies, and now they're getting lawsuits left and right from like Sony and from different game stores and stuff because they're maybe violating antitrust systems, but like when they were doing it, it's all just kind of like a shell game that they're playing. And I think that kind of pushes on. There used to be a lot of strength in holding back, like the funnels were really strong, and deregulation has kind of weakened some of those funnels at the top level, where like the interaction you have with a local business owner about their taxes is going to be much more concrete to them than the conversation that someone in the finance department at Microsoft has with someone in the treasury department.
Yeah, and these conversations can probably be very different too, just because of the scale at hand. I mean, I think there's been a lot of rabble around like the however many new IRS agents are supposed to be hired with this latest round of funding in the last federal budget. With the nature of it being that if like the IRS wants to audit a really big corporation or a private individual that is like a billionaire, like the resources it takes to do that is like astronomical as well. So, and knowing the right people can definitely help you there as well, I'm sure. But yeah, it's a different ball game when you're probably dealing with a mom and pop shop that sells does like auto repair or something versus a multinational corporation that has all these resources, has lawyers that can obstruct at every point or question everything that they're able to question. And there was another point I had in mind. Yeah, the antitrust, kind of the decline of antitrust regulation has been pretty disappointing to see. I know Ticketmaster has been a very recent favorite thing to pick on. It feels like tangible, though I wouldn't say necessary, instance of like people getting absolutely ramrodded because of lack of competition.
It's interesting that, like, to me, that seems like one of those industries that the political system would be incentivized to not allow the degradation of its consumer protections, because it's like
Hmm.
a strong notion of if you can keep your population entertained and it's affordable, right? And this goes towards companies like Microsoft and them having antitrust lawsuits against them, is the fundamental thing they're trying to do is make entertainment more expensive so they can make more money,
Hmm.
or force other people out of the market so they can capitalize on more market share. But neither of those options vibe well with consumer protections. They're pretty antithetical towards them. And I think that there's a very similar kind of notion with, like, it's very easy to look at deregulation and say these instances are the ones we should like look at, but while Ticketmaster and Microsoft are important, I think it's significantly more important what's happening with, like, I haven't seen anything in the last decade that's like truly investigating on like food quality, right? In
Mm.
the sense of like I've seen reports of children working in food factories overnight, like under the age of 16 in hazardous
Hmm.
conditions. And like to me, that was we figured that out in the 20s. But we're rolling it back. And that's the thing, is it's like I think the political system, it's beneficial for it to have us talk about Ticketmaster and Microsoft and whatnot and these like entertainment representations of it, and not, you know, some food company that's out processing chickens at a million chickens a fucking year or whatever, and they've got 10-year-olds. spraying down the equipment at night.
Yeah, I think because it also gets into, it's like, I don't want to say it's a difficult conversation to have around children working in unsafe, or even, I mean, just children working in general. If it is something for like a simple, like, kind of retail summary job kind of thing, like having children work, especially, well, underage children working in any situation that isn't like on a family farm or something, or running a lemonade stand. But yeah, it gets into a more difficult question too, of labor getting more expensive in the United States. We don't really have much manufacturing at all that isn't extremely automated. And with the pandemic and with inflation and with the kind of, I guess, well, we have an aging population too, don't we? So a lot of workforce left during the pandemic. That created a lot of openings. A lot of people left to other jobs. A lot of people realized they could work virtual jobs, from the comfort of their home that pay them better. So you get to this point where labor is so expensive, but you still have some labor processes you want to do in the United States. And, it's either run your cost up, potentially run your price up, or I guess, hire some kids under the table. And hopefully the labor people don't figure that out. But
Yeah, I mean,
I think it might be more uncomfortable too to confront like the raising prices of. I mean, people have already been confronting the raising prices of food for the last couple of years, but I'm sure they also don't want to cut in on their profit margins any more than they have to.
it's interesting that I think, to me, the rise of child labor specifically has happened in a weird correlation with the decrease of migrant labor violations being public, right? And so the companies that were getting targeted for immigration violations, I'm not saying that they all did this one thing. I'm saying that there's like an interesting correlation specifically in as migrant workers, and like, I think this gets into a much more complicated conversation about market economics, but like, as the market has shifted towards this notion of internalized cheap labor, the only option for internalized cheap labor is literally children, because you can not pay them. And I think that's a big part of it, is like, I read a report about a Wendy's in Kentucky or West Virginia, where there was a 10-year-old working a night shift and not getting paid. And like, the whole notion of working a night shift at 10 is no. That's like a hard no for me in a cooking environment. Like, absolutely not. But then not getting paid as well is like, at that point, you have a child slave at a fast food restaurant. Like, and that's indicative of the American system right now and how it's kind of corrupting itself. Is 10, 15 years ago, that would have destroyed the brand. Like, not that one franchise location, but the whole brand would have taken a huge hit for having an unpaid 10-year-old working a night shift once. Right? That's a huge red flag. But now it's like, who gives a shit?
Yeah, tolerances have shifted. As long as you're not, sending a trans influencer a beer with like their picture on it, you're fine.
Yeah. No, I agree with you that tolerances have definitely shifted. I think people, this goes towards the elected officials, kind of what is their purpose, not in the sense of like what is their job, but like what is their like big goal is to adjust those tolerances. And I think a lot of politicians have been very successful in adjusting their constituents' tolerances away from concern about their ability to participate in the economic system to concern about their ability to maintain their moral view. And that tolerance is so much more important to them because it's attached to a foundational aspect of who they are. But that's not the purpose of government, right? It's like not the outcome purpose of a bureaucratic system. It is the input purpose of this group in the system, because it allows them to adjust things like taxation rates. How much revenue goes towards public projects and private projects, right? Like the privatization of education, all of those kind of steps, they are married hand in hand with adjusting people's perspective on those things to a moral issue, in the sense of like, as I moved away from Florida, one of the things that was becoming popular and then became law after I left was the Don't Say Gay bill, right? And it goes on to the enableization of PragerU content as educational content, and like that notion of shifting the discussion to we need to be maintaining this moral framework of conservative American ideology a la Ron DeSantis and what he thinks Florida should be doing, that shifts that conversation away from are teachers getting paid enough for the work that they're doing, right? And why do we need to go get veterans to go fill in without any kind of education on specifically doing, elementary or middle school or whatever developmental education, and we're just throwing them into this with here's some PragerU clips, right? Those aren't teachers, like they're not. And so that's the thing is it's very easy to you don't have to think about there are no teachers available because there's a huge shortage and they're all striking and they hate working in this kind of environments because you've maintained the moral framework. That's the key thing. It doesn't matter that the system is crumbling because the moral framework is sound.
Yeah, I mean, a moral panic is probably more exciting and more attention maintaining than, some policy package on what percentage you're going to raise teachers' pay each year or how much you're going to contribute to their retirement funds. So I don't think it's definitely you're at a disadvantage when discussing the actual policy by nature of it being less exciting than some kind of conspiracy of people being out to get their kids or fighting. I know a recent kind of a recent movement that's been growing up is parents should have rights to, be able to dictate what their children learn in school, which there could be an interesting conversation about, but even that kind of gets swept under the rug by this moral panic that's getting whipped up increasingly in, let's say, more conservative states.
Yeah, this is actually we'll do a quick tangent right here because this is something that I think about a lot. Is that a constant complaint of conservative-minded people is that basic financial education isn't taught to people before they graduate high school, but that's not true. That fundamentally is not true. If you pay attention in math and you do 4 years of math in high school, even if you start at a remedial level, by the time you finish, if you've graduated, the math level that you've reached is enough to do basic financial math. It's enough to do complex financial math because financial math isn't hard. The problem is there's nothing that teaches people the skill set of drive and of self-determination towards dealing with your own responsibilities that will be coming to you the second you leave this institution. That is a core problem that I can agree on, but it needs to be a basic skills course is ridiculous. And I think that is kind of on that same kind of plane of it's shifting it just enough to say this doesn't have the value that our children need. My children need to know how to balance a checkbook, right? Would be the argument of 20 years ago. No, your children really should know how to use Excel. It's way more important.
Yeah, I just wish that's the kind of discussion that was being had over what's being taught in the classroom. Something more constructive, than just saying, oh, we're afraid that if people are transing our kids secretly at school or calling them Joe instead of Jimmy,
Dude, they're transing them with Common Core math.
Yeah, exactly. It's that's a whole other tangent that can maybe gone down another day. But that's, I guess, maybe something that also could be brought up is that it feels like kind of the lower echelons of, because the elected officials is going to be inherently political, and not to say that the public servants and full-time employees aren't going to be a more that politics isn't going to exist at those realms either. But it kind of feels like they're being brought in more and more. Look at
from
the
CDC.
Top down. Yeah, or not even necessarily. It's when these moral panics get whipped up or conspiracy theories become more and more popular. You look at the CDC and look at Anthony Fauci, someone who is a career. Yeah, he's appointed, but the CDC is a more professional-leaning policy division than a political party, or if I'm thinking like a cabinet secretary or something. That's going to be something where you're telling them to go in a specific direction.
Yeah, instead of just someone who's an
But
employee of this federal institution.
yeah, well, the CDC is more or less like, yeah, you want to pick someone confident to head it, and Fauci is someone who'd headed it or headed the infectious diseases division or whatever division he led for, like, under multiple presidents for like well over a decade, but like came under attack for doing his job just as well as he'd done it because some people decided they wanted to blame him for a lot of what was going on around the world.
Yeah, and I that kind of gets to he fell into the public servant aspect of he became the lightning rod for criticism of he made the mistake of being the face.
Mm-hmm.
And that's nothing against him. I think someone had to do it, and like it sucks for the rest of his life, everything that he's gonna have to deal with. But it's the
Mm-hmm.
second you either accept the ego or you put it aside and say I'm willing to take what this comes with and be the face for this. There's benefit to that and there's cost to it, right? And like a good example of this is for 30 years, Mitch McConnell worked to become the face of the Republican Party in the Senate, right? And that was very valuable for the Republican Party for like the last decade specifically, up until like the last year. For like the last decade, it really worked for them to have this one dude be the face, where he could be the dude that said, I got these people to vote for this, or I got these people to vote against this. I'm the person holding this up, right? It's me, me, me. But the downside to that is, as he's maintained that, his deterioration in the public space has cost a significant amount. It's done significant damage to not only his leadership perspectives, but also the party as a whole. And this kind of reflects against with Feinstein as well, right? The recent attorney or power of attorney transition, like that is a bad look for any elected official. Like at that point, you should kind of be having conversations about resigning, like publicly. And it's in a very similar thing of we've had presidents in the past where they've like gone into surgery and given up their power of presidency while they're unconscious, right? And it's a thing that is criticized by people still of being responsible and saying, look, I'm not going to be conscious. Someone needs to be able to maintain control of this while I'm out, right? And like
Mm-hmm.
so there's a 50-50 there of even if you do it and take the step back and say, you know what, I'm done, right? People are still going to criticize you and say that's the coward's way out. You should have kept going.
Yeah, and maybe a little bit more on McConnell and the elected officials because you can steer the value windows. I see that on there, but I think McConnell and a lot of the Republican kind of establishment figures kind of steered the window out of their control. In going into 2016, Trump came along, they backed him as they needed to, and it felt like basically McConnell had, apart from Senate, like kind of the mechanics of it, like choosing Supreme Court, like whipping votes for like things that they agreed on doing, it felt like more or less he lost being the face of the Republican Party. I mean, the president's always going to take being the face of the party,
Oh
but
yeah, no,
Trump was kind of an anomaly.
I agree with you. I specifically, I think he has done a very good job of being the face of the Senate for the Republican Party.
Okay. Yeah.
In the same way that like Adam Schiff did a very good job for over the last decade of instituting himself as a face of Democratic congressional perspectives, right? And there are a couple standouts on both sides that they as they've become I'm going to say more annoying, their profile has risen, right? Jim
Mm-hmm.
Jordan, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi. You can go on both sides back and forth of the thing that gets them attention is fundamentally annoying the fuck out of whoever's on the other side. And it works, right? Like in
Yeah.
the same way that this is pissing off the libs and like look at them cry about tax cuts that are going to affect DACA students or whatever. It's the same thing with now you have to force gay people or you're forced to marry gay people even though it violates your religious beliefs, right? It's two sides of the same coin of it's people just like shoveling shit at each other for the purpose of raising their profile, right? And
Yeah.
like
It's team sports.
yeah, and it's interesting is one word for it that I don't know, they seem very copacetic with each other. Like it seems like watching wrestling is probably the best way I could describe it. And that's the part that I think at a their value versus the application side of it becomes frustrating is it's like just knowing that there are 20 million people out there whose lives depend on a stable governance system, both at the state and federal level. And everybody in the military is in that boat as well, right? And there's a ton of people that are reliant on these systems working to have food or medicine or the ability to go to their job, right? Whatever it is. To see it become a very, very theatrical and very, very ideologically charged instead of policy charged is disappointing. And that it drives the value of individuals who push that way up is disappointing for that system.
Yeah, I would say that kind of a source of optimism I've had, being a fan of institutions, the Trump presidency was a pretty dark time to be watching the kind of national political landscape at play. But it does feel like largely our institutions are pretty resilient. Like the CDC was still able to work despite constant public attack from various public officials. Sometimes Trump himself, a lot of people that Trump was friends with in the Senate and in the House. I feel like despite all of this happening, they were still able to do their work. We had January 6th happen, and our election system, while currently still very damaged, it feels like, by unsubstantiated claims of corruption or things not working, it feels like it did largely work very well. We had multiple audits of various results in various kind of high-profile counties, states, a lot of court work going on. It feels like largely this stuff has been pretty resilient. We can say that some stuff has been like maybe too resilient, like look at the Supreme Court right now is stacked the way it's stacked and making some pretty activist decisions. But that maybe is too close to the elected officials and that, it's a direct result of who's going to get appointed and what kind of decisions they're going to make is going to be directly based on who gets elected.
Yeah.
But, a lot of stuff is still working, like, despite being, having shit stuffed into its intake for the last, 4 years before this last presidency started.
Yeah, it's interesting that the unintentional effect of a volatile political period for me has been a increase in focus and interest at the state and local level representations of the real political power exchange. And it's something in the local area that I'm living now in Oregon that's super prevalent, but it's also something that I think moving from Florida up to the Pacific Northwest and seeing how vastly different people view the political systems in those two areas, it both galvanized my perspective of hope for a lot of people, but it also very much grounds a negative reality that there are a lot of states that are being essentially ransacked by their political leadership for value, right? They're being essentially consumed as a populace, and they don't have wide-scale structural protection in place, right? And so you can see there's a lot of institutional strength in states like Washington and Oregon and California and coastal states in general. But then you look at a state like Georgia, right? And the amount of political power is so localized in their wealth regions that the people who are outside of them, they don't have any engagement with it, right? And I think that that's one of those things that it's almost done purposefully, of coalescing positive political power is driven by a notion of it aggregating at a scaling level.
Isn't that going to largely be true for Washington and Oregon too? A lot of people in Eastern Washington
on the inverse, absolutely.
Yeah.
The difference to this that I think is that people in a conservative mindset that truly believe in the libertarian conservative kind of economic freedom, political freedom notion, right? they don't give a shit what the government is doing anyways, right? Like
Hmm.
there's some of it that's taxes and whatnot, but like what's going into education systems is fundamentally less important to what they're teaching their kids. Like they don't give a shit about what's being taught at school because what they're teaching their kids is what they believe is fundamentally what's going to attach as their belief system, right? And that the family structure is the biggest propagator of historical information instead of the societal structure. So, like, while that is an accurate assessment of the political power, the difference is the political power reality for people who are self-determinate or self-deterministic in the sense of individualism versus being part of a collective is that it gives them more opportunity to do that. Like fundamentally, like in a logical sense, it gives them the amount of opportunity they have hasn't changed.
Perhaps I could see some people with a more libertarian conservative mindset. I know private schools versus public schools has become a larger issue. Like people wanting more access to vouchers. I mean, when people have to pay, their taxes into a system, and that system's going to go to a public school that they don't want to send their kid to. They'd rather opt out of that and have their, the funds they're putting in go to them being able to put their kid to a private school. Maybe not something I agree with. I think public schools are pretty rad. But
I do too, for what that's worth.
yeah, but that's maybe an instance where they do have to, even if they think that what they're going to learn at home is going to be the most valuable things they're going to learn and where they're going to learn most of what they're going to carry through their life. They are still sending their children away 8 days or 8 hours each day to somewhere they could very well ideologically oppose a lot of what's being taught. At least that's what it seems like people are being led to believe nowadays.
Yeah, and well, and this the
Along
thing
those
is, it's
party
like
lines.
we lived in Pullman, right?
Hmm.
Like I don't think that the Pullman like the Whitman County School District, was pushing super progressive educational standards. Personally,
Probably
right?
not.
Because why would they? Right? There's no incentive for any like non-urban area. The second you move away from an urban area that is trying to vie for either attention in the political sphere or like eyes in the terms of media reporting or whatnot, the second you get into suburban areas and rural areas, they have literally no incentive to push for radicalized changes to their education system. It's better for them to just stay the course. And when something from on high comes down, like Pluto's no longer a planet, right? And everyone is like, okay, we're going to agree now. Like, then you get a little change, right? But,
Hmm.
like, there's no incentive for it except with the outset of highly religious communities that are trying to affect their local institutions. But that's a very distinct individual example, right? It's like school, like there was a big push when I was in high school because I was in private school in Florida, uh, for public schools to teach evolution and creative design or intelligent design
Hmm.
at the same time, which is ridiculous. It has no basis in scientific education to do that. But the fact that that was something that's not only still a conversation, but it propagated throughout the country, it represents, like, I think, the value of kind of pushing these conversations away from basic standardized education that, in and of itself can have, like, I think that there's a big value conversation of how much of the stuff that's taught to children is enriching their capacity to think and like actually learn new things, and how much of it is conforming them to go be 10% over the poverty line for the rest of their life, which is it's terrifying. Like, and I think that that's
Hmm.
something, if you presented that to parents of like the next 18 years of your or whatever 15 years of your child's life will be conforming them to participate in a system where their statistical likelihood is meagerly above the poverty line, would incentivize a bunch of people to reform education immediately.
Yeah, I guess it'd just be what other system would they go off to exist in. I do think I'd be mostly in conservative states. Just a quick note I had of like even history. I know history might be something that isn't as like it's not STEM. It's not like you're in improving someone's cognitive abilities to be able to do an equation or figure out a chemical compound or something like that. But I mean, there's even been issue taken recently with the way some history has been taught for decades. I mean, describing what happened to Rosa Parks on the bus. That slaves were taught useful skills that they used after they were done being slaves, being something you want to prioritize teaching. And a lot of this stuff is going to be dictated by, state standards, and then districts have some level of what they can say or what they do or don't want to do. But yeah, I'm not super, I guess, knowledgeable on what state standards look like or what that share of power is state by state, but
Yeah,
or federally.
I think it's one of those things where it's like it's a double-sided sword because the past 15 years has really exemplified to me why the 10th Amendment kicks ass and why living in states like Washington and Oregon and visiting states like Colorado is awesome because they have some kind of congruency with my general political perspective, right? And so the fact that those options are there is awesome, but it's the catch-22 of the more that power is localized away from the top level organized system into abstracted states, the more opportunity the individual instances of power have to be extracted by, I'm not even going to call them bad actors because what they're doing is fundamental to the core of their mission because that power is required to, steer value windows, to act on laws, to perform their duty, right? And so you whether it's money, whether it's time, whether it's people in the workforce, however you want to, delineate it, it's a representation of is that power being reinserted back into the lowest levels and being used to lift everybody up, or is it being trickled down from the top, right? And I think you can look at the success, economic and workforce success of states and model and say when it's building it from the ground up and you're empowering the people who are in the workforce through governance, that generates a lot of value, not only for the governance system, but also for the state and the people in it. And when you trickle it down, you get less results, but people have more opportunity to have their own choice about that.
No, I'd agree.
Well, I think we covered some interesting topics. Do you have anything you want to add?
Not in particular. Let me just look through our 3 circles here. Yeah, no, I guess I would agree with the overall idea of local politics being the most important. I think largely our political issues are kind of like a gigantic web where everything ties into each other. You're going to have systemic racism is going to be tied to where you live, which is going to be tied to where you go to school, which is going to be tied to what public services are available to you, how well are they funded, how much money do you have to spend on where you live, are you renting, are you owning, how well funded is the school you're going to, or how incentivized are your teachers or your police officers to live in the communities that they're teaching in or policing in. So everything is a huge web, and where you're going to affect most of those small things on the web is going to be via local board decisions, local district decisions, probably state government decisions. In somewhere like Washington, housing is something big for me. We had a
policy
bill that passed this year. Yeah, we had a bill this year that basically overrid all local zoning around bus stations and transit stations and made it so people are no longer just locked to building single family homes. Being able to build townhouses and sixplexes and duplexes in these places is going to make way more housing, which is going to make it way more affordable.
Yeah.
So that's something that you're never going to get the federal government to mass override zoning in states that they don't have that kind of jurisdiction in. So
it's definitely a scope thing. I think there's a number that kind of it threw me when I saw it, is that it's something like 2/3 of the states have more government employees than there are people in Wyoming. So that's a good representation of why it just wouldn't work. You can't have, there's a whole state out there that if you were all right, we're just gonna radically change a set of rules, they have 600,000 people. That's not going to work for them. It's way different there. And Alaska is another good example. The amount of investment into their government infrastructure is the highest out of any state proportionally. It's something like 35%. It's ridiculous, right? But it
Yeah.
makes sense because it's a giant wilderness that the population is actively trying to tame for resources or whatever. But like, I feel like most of the people are fighting a losing battle in Alaska in the sense of that's a place that really wants to be nature.
Hmm.
So they need a lot of people working in a kind of conjoined effort and not there for their own desires, but the collective kind of purpose of generating value for the state, generating value for the people who live there, increasing the kind of baseline to draw people out of, especially people who live in very isolated areas in Alaska. That draws a lot of value for them.
Yeah, I mean, look at the postal service. I think that there are officially like mail carrying mules that go down into the Grand Canyon. Like that's something that you would never get from private enterprise that public service is able to provide.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there's similar things in Florida, or not Florida, in Alaska. Yeah, with those remote people who otherwise wouldn't really be able to exist connected to society without, you know, some probably snow-bearing mule carrying mail to them or some plane dropping it off.
Or some ridiculous tunnel that they got to drive through or something like that. I
Yeah, he's gonna
definitely
build that
watched
tunnel.
I definitely watched a video relatively recently about a girl who went like 4 hours out of the way to the most isolated part in Alaska, and it's like 80 people living in a hotel essentially, and they're the
Jeez.
residents of the town, and it's like a fishing stop that it's just like the last one for a while, so there has to be people there, otherwise boats would just be stranded. So
Jeez.
it's exactly that, right? Someone has to pay those salaries, someone has to keep the electricity running to middle of fucking nowhere Alaska so 80 people can have their hotel living
Yeah, and don't freeze to death.
so we can have fish. Right? Like that's it. That's it all boils down to so fishing can happen and continue to happen or whatever it is. Cruise lines. Who cares what it is? It's something that collectively the state of Alaska and the consumer base that goes there said, yeah, we need it.
Yeah, let's fund it.
Well, Mitchell, I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me about this. I think we kind of got into some pretty interesting points. Um,
Yeah, thanks for having me.
yeah, man. This has been a meaningful discussion. Thanks.